The Sumerians are one of the most influential people in the history of the world. Historians and archaeologists alike credit them with many human innovations, including the first real cities, writing, mathematics, more sophisticated farming techniques, engineering, and according to some scholars, beer. They occupied the region that bears their name, Sumer, which specifically was located roughly where the flatlands of southeastern Mesopotamia met the Persian Gulf. Today, that would be a good portion of southern Iraq. By the 4th millennium BCE, they were the dominant civilization in this region and began to build the first cities and develop technology that has influenced our world up until this day. What we call Sumerian civilization arose and flourished in Mesopotamia during the 3rd millennium BCE. The terms Sumer and Sumerian come from the Akkadian word Shumerum. The Sumerians themselves called their country Kiengir and themselves Sagiga, which is believed to have meant black-headed people. Scholars in the field of archaeology, history, and even anthropology are still not exactly sure where the Sumerians came from. Some believe that they were the descendants of people from Central Asia who migrated into Mesopotamia via Iran around the 6th millennium BCE. There are others who believe that the Sumerians actually originated in what is today southern India, while others look much further west to Africa. And then, there are those who fervently believe that they were extraterrestrials. Yes, that's actually a theory. We have lots of other theories as well, but little proof. Of course, they could have also been indigenous to the Near Eastern region, but this seems highly unlikely because their language was unlike anything else in Mesopotamia at the time. Actually, not just Mesopotamia. Sumerian is unlike any other language, ancient or modern, that has been known to exist anywhere in the world. The Sumerians weren't the first people to occupy Mesopotamia. There were actually several other cultures who inhabited the region long before them. To go into even a small percentage of them would be a huge endeavor and is well beyond the scope of this program. But the major ones were the Samara, Halaf, and Ubaid cultures. These cultures all inhabited the area of the ancient Near East, living in small settlements and villages until the rise of what we'd call cities. Shortly after the Sumerians arrived in Mesopotamia, they seem to have intermingled with the region's native inhabitants, adopting much of their cultural and religious beliefs. Eventually, they moved into their cities as well. For example, some of the sites that we consider to be the oldest cities in the world, Eridu, Uruk, and Ur, were not Sumerian in origin. They had been occupied for thousands of years prior to the Sumerians, probably as religious sites. Because these earliest of inhabitants didn't have a written language, we can just make educated guesses from archaeological evidence about what their lives might have been like. However, it's clear that with the arrival of the Sumerians in the region, the character of these settlements changed tremendously. They went from being small towns into what we'd identify as full-fledged cities or urban centers. And it's really from here that history as we know it begins. The first real historical period of Mesopotamia is what modern scholars call the early dynastic period. What's cool about the early dynastic period is that it provided the first opportunity to compare archaeological evidence with cuneiform texts. Probably the most important of these documents is what's known as the Sumerian King List. This text, or really series of texts, of which there are several versions, records the names and dynasties of kings that ruled Sumer from the earliest times. Though there were many cities springing up along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, two of them, Eridu and Uruk, are of special note. It's still debated by scholars which one of these is the oldest in the world. Most say Eridu, but there are compelling arguments in favor of Uruk as well. In character though, these cities were a bit different. Eridu was more of a religious and ceremonial center, while Uruk was primarily an administrative one. However, the Sumerian King List, of which the earliest known version dates to about 2125 BCE, makes it clear which was first when it states, and I quote, "After kingship descended from the heavens, the seat of kingship was in the city of Eridu. In Eridu, Alulim became king and reigned for 28,800 years." Alulim in Sumerian tradition was the first king of the world. Sumerian tradition also states that the main seat of kingship moved or rotated to other prominent Sumerian cities, including Uruk, Ur, Kish, Lagash, Sippar, Adab, Larak, Larsa, Umma, and even distant Mari in Syria, and Awan in neighboring Elam. By the start of the early dynastic period, these cities are all believed to have been inhabited by several thousand people, with Uruk being the largest. In fact, between the years 3000 to 2700 BCE, Uruk's population may have been in the tens of thousands, making it the most densely populated urban center of its day. It had many different temples dedicated to all the various Sumerian deities, palaces for its rulers, houses for its priests, artisans, and merchants, as well as public spaces that served as ancient marketplaces. The largest temple was a type of step pyramid known as a ziggurat. Another fun fact about Uruk, it's the place where the earliest known written documents were discovered. Cities such as Uruk also had large defensive walls. Some of these structures were nearly 10 kilometers long, which was massive in those days. Though culturally they were Sumerian, politically, these cities were for the most part independent of each other. That's why we called them city-states. Each was a tiny little unit with its own ruler and government. Most, if not all of the major cities, had their own patron god or goddess. The makeup of these city-states consisted of an urban center that was surrounded by some kind of defensive wall. Around the wall, there were villages, farmland, and irrigation canals. The number of villages and acres of farmland varied. For example, documents uncovered in the ruins of the holy city of Nippur indicate that it was surrounded by as many as 200 dependent villages, 5 large irrigation canals, and at least 60 smaller canals. Though politically independent, these city-states traded not only with one another, but also with countries far from Mesopotamia, such as Elam and the Indus Valley civilizations to their east, Anatolia to the north, and Egypt and the Mediterranean world to the west. Each city-state had a ruler. Minor rulers and often even governors were called ensi, while you could say more important or powerful rulers, such as kings, were called lugal. As kings became more powerful, they sought to conquer and control their neighbors. Thus, despite their similarities in terms of language, culture, and religion, these city-states often became rivals for influence, resources, and territory, especially good farmland. By about 2600 BCE, wars between city-states were a constant part of day-to-day life. For example, around that year, there was a conflict where Uruk and Ur defeated the city-state of Kish. 100 years later, Kish rose up and defeated Uruk, Ur, and other cities. This back and forth went on for centuries between many city-states. The most famous and well-documented of these conflicts was the seemingly never-ending one between the city-states of Lagash and Umma. Despite the wars between them, all of these city-states remained steadfastly Sumerian in their language, culture, and again, religion. Thus, when other city-states conquered one of their rivals, the change did not necessarily alter the day-to-day life of the common person, only of the ruling family and perhaps some nobles. Given this constant warfare and division amongst the city-states of Sumer, it was only a matter of time before a ruler strong enough to exploit such instability would arise. This leader was Sargon of Akkad, also known as Sargon the Great, who would conquer Sumer and create the first known empire in the world. Sargon's conquest of Sumer brought an end to the era of the early dynastic period and its independent city-states. While not totally replaced, the Sumerian language became second to Akkadian, the language of the conquerors. Still, Sumerian culture, technology, and especially religion continued to play a huge role in the lives of everyone in Mesopotamia and the surrounding areas for the next few thousand years. So if you didn't before, I hope that you now have a general idea of who the Sumerians were and why they were so important. I'll be talking more about Sumerian history, as well as that of ancient Mesopotamia in general, in future programs. So, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for stopping by, I really appreciate it. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.